Hey there. Tonight, we leave behind the comfort of imagination and descend into something far darker, a truth buried beneath centuries of silence. We'll peel back the illusion of innocence, the myth of childhood as a time of joy, and stare into the face of a world that saw children not as people, but as tools. This is not a story of survival. It's a story of betrayal, by family, by faith, by the very fabric of society. Dim the lights, quiet your mind. What you're about to hear may change how you see history forever. In medieval Europe, the birth of a child was not celebrated as the arrival of a cherished new life, but rather as the emergence of future labor. From the moment a child drew breath, their worth was already being calculated in terms of what they could one day contribute to their family's survival. Their body was measured not in joy or potential, but in hours, in harvests, in coins saved or earned. There were no lullabies waiting for them, no careful dreams of education or personal growth. Instead, their existence was immediately absorbed into a web of obligation and expectation. Parents, themselves worn thin by endless toil and generational poverty, looked into the faces of their newborns, not with wonder, but with anxiety. How many years until these small hands could carry buckets, pull weeds, haul stones? How many winters could they survive before they started paying back the food they consumed? Naming ceremonies, where they existed, were perfunctory and formulaic. The child was not seen as a unique soul with a future all their own, but as a placeholder, another back to bend under the weight of feudal expectation. Fathers might assign nicknames that hinted at chores to come. Mothers would wrap their infants in rough cloth, not just for warmth, but to prepare their skin for the constant abrasion of coarse garments and hard surfaces. Inheritance traditions, particularly among the poor, rarely included provisions for children who could not yet work. A baby who cried too much, who was born frail, or who showed signs of weakness, was seen less as a tragedy waiting to happen, and more as an early liability. They were, at best, tolerated until they could earn their place at the table. At worst, they were ignored, neglected, or sacrificed when food ran short. The first years of life were not spent in play, but in quiet observation of exhaustion and pain. Children watched their mothers carry firewood with raw hands, watched their fathers fall silent after long days in the fields. They were taught through example that survival required silence, submission, and productivity. Any deviation from that path, curiosity, joy, rest, was met with impatience or punishment. The family unit did not exist to nurture individuality, but to preserve function. Every member had a role, and the youngest were reminded constantly of what was expected from them in time. A toddler was not praised for taking a first step, but nudged faster toward fetching water. By the age of 3 or 4, most children were already mimicking adult behaviors, not for fun, but because they knew their future depended on convincing the adults they were useful. This mindset extended far beyond the home. Lords, merchants, clergy, all saw children not as blessings, but as investments or liabilities. Landowners kept track of births among their serfs with interest, knowing each child represented potential wealth, provided they survived. Monasteries recorded orphans and foundlings not for their salvation, but for how they might be molded into scribes, servants, or choir boys. Even mortality was assessed through the lens of utility. A child who died young was mourned only if their labor had begun to bear fruit. If they had not yet contributed, Their death was seen as an unfortunate but acceptable loss. This was not cruelty born of malice. It was systemic, cold, and entirely normalized. In a world ruled by hunger and labor, children were not the future. They were the present's burden or its tool. Childhood, as we understand it now, did not exist. Only preparation for work. Only the silent waiting for the moment they would be old enough to serve. There was no sacred line between childhood and adulthood in the medieval world. No protective boundary within which the young could grow, dream, or play without consequence. From the moment they could stand upright and follow instructions, children were treated not as tender beings in need of nurturing, but as incomplete workers, waiting only to be shaped, hardened, and made useful. The idea that a child might deserve rest, wonder, or time to explore their thoughts was alien to the people around them. What we now call innocence was then considered a flaw, something to be burned away by discipline, labor, and silence. Laughter was not encouraged. It was often punished. Play was not indulgent. It was sinful. Curiosity was not valued. It was dangerous. Childhood, in its purest sense, was viewed as an impediment to the real work of life: obedience, toil, and survival. Children learned this lesson quickly, and often brutally. If a child lingered too long with a stick pretending it was a sword, or drew shapes in the dirt instead of gathering firewood, they would be yanked back to purpose with a slap or a shout. Any display of joy that interrupted the rhythm of labor was viewed as a disruption, not just of the task at hand, but of the entire moral order. Time spent idling was time not spent serving, and that was seen as a kind of theft. Even the smallest indulgence, a moment of rest, a song hummed under breath, could bring swift punishment. Children learned to suppress delight as a survival skill, not out of maturity, but out of necessity. They understood before they could speak in full sentences that attention came quickest through obedience, and that affection was conditional on being helpful. This wasn't limited to farmhands or peasant households. Even in wealthier homes, where children were spared the worst physical labor, the idea of unstructured time was treated with suspicion. Noble sons were drilled in weaponry, riding, and theology from the moment their limbs could hold a blade or a book. Daughters were taught etiquette, needlework, and silence with equal force. Their time was organized, their lessons relentless, their futures decided long before they reached adolescence. Their emotions were tightly controlled, with displays of fear or hesitation framed as weakness or sin. No child, regardless of class, was permitted to grow wild. They were trimmed like hedges into forms their families and society could use. The idea that a child might simply exist, to observe, to imagine, to make mistakes, was not a recognized human need. It was a threat to the carefully constructed machinery of medieval life. What was lost in this process wasn't just time or comfort. It was the entire architecture of emotional development. Children who were never allowed to play struggled to form empathy. Those who never experienced comfort could not offer it to others. The basic building blocks of imagination, storytelling, exploration, experimentation, were shattered early, replaced by habits of silence, vigilance, and submission. These children didn't just grow up fast. They were never young at all. Their days were filled with labor, their nights with fatigue, and their thoughts with survival. They became adults before they understood what it meant to be human. And the most haunting truth of all is that no one around them saw this as a tragedy. It was the way things were. It was the way things had always been. And so the innocence that might have bloomed quietly in other times, in other worlds, was suffocated before it had a chance to speak. She doesn't cry when she lets go of his hand. Her fingers linger for just a second longer than they should. But then they release, and the boy, no more than 6, walks through the wooden gate of the milliard without turning around. She stays just long enough to see him vanish into the shadows of the building, then returns away. Not because she doesn't care, not because she feels nothing, but because she cannot afford to. Her other children are waiting. The grain must still be ground. The goats must still be milked. The landlord still expects his share. And the bread she can bake this week depends on the few copper coins she's been promised in exchange for her son's labor. This isn't a scene of cruelty. It is a portrait of despair. She is not a monster. She is a mother in a world that leaves no room for softness. The choice she made was not a real choice. It was the only option between slow starvation and a faster one. Across medieval Europe, parents routinely sent their children into the service of others, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The line between love and sacrifice was razor thin and often invisible. A family living on the edge of subsistence could not afford to feed a child who didn't work. In years of crop failure or disease, even a few extra mouths could tip the balance from hunger to death. The parents who handed over their children to monasteries, mills, or manorial estates did so with clenched jaws and hollow eyes. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves the child would be fed, perhaps even clothed, maybe taught something. But deep inside, they knew what the world was. They knew children in those places were beaten, starved, and broken. They knew their child might not return, and still they sent them. Because there was no food in the cupboard, because winter was coming, because the Lord's taxes would not wait for compassion. This is the cruelty of poverty. It doesn't just take food and warmth. It takes the very structure of what love is allowed to be. A mother who loved her son might still send him to the fields at dawn and ignore his tears. A father who adored his daughter might still trade her labor for a few sacks of grain. The world they lived in taught them that survival required these betrayals. Affection could exist, but only behind closed doors, only in whispers, only in stolen seconds between shifts of labor. Open tenderness was dangerous. It made letting go harder. And letting go was what life demanded again and again. The stories that have survived from this time often paint parents as callous or indifferent, but that is a failure of understanding. These were people trapped in a system that forced them to choose which of their children would suffer first, and how much. They were asked, without words, to decide whose back would break so that the others might stand a little longer. When we think of cruelty, we imagine it wearing the face of hatred. But the most common face of cruelty in the medieval world was love denied by necessity. A mother who turned her face away as her daughter was led into a stranger's kitchen was not heartless. She was surviving. A father who struck his son for crying out during work was not a brute. He was trying to keep the boy alive one more day. These acts do not excuse themselves. They left wounds that ran deep and crossed generations. But they must be seen clearly, not with moral clarity, but with human empathy. These parents didn't want their children to suffer. They simply lived in a world where there was no path forward that didn't involve pain. And so, the choices they made, the ones they could never speak aloud, the ones that haunted them at night, became the architecture of survival. Not because they were right, but because they were all that was left. By the time most children turned 4, their world was no longer measured in play, but in tasks. There was no ceremony, no recognition of a threshold crossed, only a quiet shift in expectations. One day they were too small to help. The next day, they were expected to carry their weight. At first, the jobs were small: chasing chickens from the grain, gathering kindling, collecting dung for fuel. But even these early tasks came with the weight of responsibility. Failure wasn't seen as natural or forgivable. It was seen as disobedience. Dropping a bucket, spilling a pail, or forgetting a chore could lead to a sharp slap, a shouted curse, or worse. These were not treated as childish mistakes. They were treated as disruptions in the rhythm of adult survival. A 4-year-old in a medieval village was not a baby. They were an apprentice to hardship, expected to learn quickly, stay quiet, and not get in the way. It didn't matter that their limbs were still soft or that their feet were unsteady. They were given tools that didn't fit their hands, clothes that didn't fit their bodies, and burdens that didn't fit their strength. A stick taller than the child might be placed in their hands to herd geese or pigs. A water bucket nearly as heavy as they were would be pressed against their ribs. They would be expected to walk behind older siblings for miles without rest, dragging loads through mud or snow. Complaints brought nothing but scorn. Adults rarely knelt down to speak at a child's eye level. Instructions were barked from above, often in tones used for livestock. The child learned quickly that obedience earned silence, and silence was the closest thing to peace. If they stumbled, no one offered a hand. If they cried, they were reminded that others had it worse. If they succeeded, the reward was more work. There were no weekends, no scheduled breaks, no moments carved out for growth or leisure. A child's day began at first light, just like the adults, and often ended long after sunset. In some households, a 4-year-old would be expected to help prepare meals, fetch tools, sweep ash from the hearth, or even fan the coals through the night to keep the fire alive. In winter, their hands cracked and bled from cold and handling rough surfaces. In summer, their skin burned raw from hours beneath the sun. Their bellies were rarely full, and what food they received was the least and the last. A child who could not yet pronounce every word in their language might already know the mechanics of grinding grain, plucking feathers, stripping weeds from the root. And when visitors arrived or taxes came due, these children would be sent to work longer, harder, with less food and no rest. Their value was measured in tasks completed, not in smiles offered or lessons learned. To outsiders, it might seem unimaginable to see a 4-year-old bent under a sack of wool or stirring a pot of animal fat with hands that barely reached the rim. But to those living in that world, it was completely normal. Not just accepted, but expected. There was no outrage, no protection, no pause to consider whether it might be too soon. The idea that a child should be free from labor simply did not exist. Work was life, and if a child was old enough to stand, they were old enough to work. The softness of early years, the time we now see as crucial for emotional and intellectual development, was instead used to mold obedience, endurance, and silence. There was no patience for delay, no space for innocence. Childhood didn't begin in medieval Europe. It ended, often before it had a name. A child falls. Their knee splits open on a jagged stone, blood seeping through the dirt on their bare legs. They cry out, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small yelp of pain and surprise. But the reaction they receive is not comfort. It is a glare, a rebuke, a command to stand up and keep moving. There are no arms reaching out to lift them, no voices whispering reassurance. The adult nearby, perhaps a parent, perhaps a master, doesn't stop their work. They don't even slow. In the medieval world, weakness wasn't just ignored, it was punished. Pain was expected to be swallowed, and tears were seen as a form of rebellion. Children learned early that their suffering was not something to be shared, not something that evoked care, but something that endangered them further. Crying meant attention, and attention meant trouble. It was safer to be quiet. It was safer to bleed in silence. This philosophy wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It was communicated through every interaction, every raised eyebrow, every strike that came too quickly, every chore that continued without pause after injury. Boys were told to be strong, to take it like a man, even when their hands were too small to hold a tool. Girls were told to be silent, graceful, composed, even when their stomachs cramped from hunger, or their backs ached from lifting loads far too heavy. The message was clear. Discomfort was irrelevant. Pain was irrelevant. Emotion was irrelevant. What mattered was function, obedience, and the ability to endure. A child who cried too often was labeled lazy. A child who hesitated was a problem. And a child who broke down completely, who collapsed under the weight of exhaustion or injury, was simply replaced. No one mourned a weak link in the chain. There were always more children to take their place. The punishments for showing weakness varied, but they were always swift. A slap across the face for a misplaced complaint. A blow to the back for slowing down. Withholding food, withholding sleep, withholding even the barest gesture of kindness. These were not exceptions. These were the rule. In monasteries, crying during prayers might lead to a beating or extra labor. In workshops, failing to keep up with a task meant being mocked in front of peers, or worse, being locked in dark spaces until the sobs stopped. In homes, even loving parents might respond to tears with threats. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that their children would not survive if they didn't learn to harden fast. And so empathy itself became a risk. To comfort a crying sibling was to draw attention. To stop and help someone in pain was to delay the work. The only safe path was to stay silent and pretend not to feel. Over time, the lesson etched itself deep into children's minds. They stopped expressing emotion, not because they grew numb, but because they learned that expression was dangerous. Their faces became blank. Their eyes dulled. Their injuries went unspoken. Their grief buried. They endured, but not without cost. What was destroyed in the process was not just their ability to trust others with their pain, but their ability to understand that pain mattered at all. It became background noise, a constant hum in the bones, in the joints, in the belly. And without a name, without comfort, it turned inward. These children didn't grow up learning resilience. They grew up learning silence. They didn't become stronger. They became afraid of being seen as weak. And that fear stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Because in a world that offered no room for weakness, there could be no tenderness, no softness, only the dull ache of survival. In a world where suffering was constant and unavoidable, the Church offered not relief, but justification. For medieval clergy, the pain of the poor, and especially the pain of children, was not something to be questioned or remedied. It was to be sanctified. Hardship was seen as divine instruction. Hunger was spiritual discipline. Labor was purification. The cries of children echoed through the fields and workshops, and the church did not raise its voice to stop them. Instead, it whispered that these cries were holy, that each lash of the whip or callus on a small hand was drawing the soul closer to God. This was not a peripheral belief. It was central to medieval theology. From the pulpit, priests preached that children were born sinful, tainted by original fault, and that only through obedience and pain could they be made righteous. The church did not see child labor as a social evil. It saw it as moral instruction, discipline imposed for the good of the soul. This belief was not just spiritual, it was institutional. Monasteries, cathedrals, and religious estates all relied on the labor of children. Oblates, children given to the church by their families, woke in the cold before dawn to pray, to scrub, to carry, to copy. Their days were filled with chanting they barely understood, with tasks far beyond their strength, with punishments for every stumble. They were told that each hardship was a gift. If they suffered silently, they were praised for their piety. If they cried out, they were accused of rebellion against God. In monasteries across Europe, ledgers were kept not just of donations and grain, but of children. How many could be housed? How many had died? How many could be worked harder without collapse? When a child grew ill, they were often dismissed or left to die. Not because there was no food or shelter, but because the community believed their usefulness, and therefore their purpose, had expired. In those same halls where monks copied Holy Scripture, children's names were erased from memory the moment their labor ceased. Even in sermons and teachings aimed at parents, the church urged severity. To spare the rod was to spoil the child, they said. To break a child's will was to save their soul. Compassion was discouraged if it interfered with discipline. Parents were praised not for protecting their children, but for preparing them to suffer well. To work without complaint was the highest virtue a child could possess. The idea that innocence deserved protection did not exist in practice. In fact, the concept of innocence itself was warped. True innocence meant not joy or freedom, but submission. A quiet child who endured hardship with downcast eyes was seen as holy. A curious, lively, laughing child was dangerous, an embodiment of temptation, of pride, of disobedience. The church shaped not just belief, but behavior. It trained entire generations to see their children's pain not as tragedy, but as necessity. And because the church spoke with the voice of eternity, no one dared question it aloud. This spiritual framework didn't just excuse child labor, it empowered it. It wrapped exploitation in the language of salvation. Lords who employed children in brutal conditions could rest easy knowing that their chaplain would bless the effort. Guildmasters who beat apprentices were told that pain taught humility. Even when children died under cruel hands, the system offered reassurance. The child, it was said, had been spared the temptations of adulthood and was now with God. This logic gave cover to horror. It allowed the adults of the time to participate in systematic cruelty while believing they were doing good. And so the chain of suffering remained unbroken, not because people were evil, but because they believed they were holy. In cathedrals built with the crushed fingers of children, candles were lit in their memory, and prayers were said for their souls. But no one asked why their bodies had been broken to begin with. No one dared to imagine that the God they worshipped might have wept. Behind the high stone walls of monasteries that towered over the villages below, prayers were whispered for mercy, for love, for the protection of the innocent. But those same walls hid a darker truth. one that stained the very foundation of the Church's wealth and power. While monks preached humility and compassion, they profited from the relentless suffering of the most vulnerable. Children, some orphaned by plague, others given away by starving families, became the invisible engines of monastic prosperity. Their small hands scrubbed floors, hauled water, tended livestock, and copied manuscripts from dawn until long past dusk. Their labor was unpaid, their injuries ignored, their spirits crushed under the weight of rituals they barely understood. The same monks who delivered sermons on Christian charity walked past limping children without acknowledgement, turning their eyes toward gold-leafed books and full pantries stocked with tithes. The contradiction was not hidden, it was institutionalized. The cloister did not deny its use of child labor. It simply called it service to God. These children were not treated as novices or learners. They were treated as resources. Every breath they took, every hour they toiled, was calculated. In ledgers kept by monastery stewards, children were listed next to livestock and grain. Notes tracked their productivity, their obedience, their physical endurance. When one became ill or injured, it was noted only in terms of whether they could still perform their tasks. When one died, they were replaced with a quiet efficiency. There were no graves with names, no masses for the souls of broken servants. Instead, the Church recorded the event as a marginal loss, a reminder to procure another child before winter. The suffering was not invisible. It was ignored with purpose. Monasteries grew rich on the backs of children they were supposed to shelter. Their wool was spun by small, bleeding hands. Their wine was pressed by boys too young to lift the barrels. Their holy garments were sewn by girls whose fingers trembled with cold and fatigue. The greatest hypocrisy lay not in the silence, but in the celebration. As cathedrals rose across Europe, stone by stone, sermon by sermon, the Church praised itself as the guardian of the weak. And yet beneath every arch, in every crypt, were the bones of the children who made it possible. The clergy spoke of salvation while ignoring the bruises on the arms of the boys who rang their bells. They blessed noble patrons who donated gold earned through exploitative mills staffed by children. They praised godly labor while turning monasteries into factories of unpaid suffering. And the faithful believed them. The more the Church insisted that pain had meaning, the more eagerly people justified the cruelties they saw with their own eyes. Parents found comfort in knowing their child's suffering served a spiritual purpose. Lords donated with the assurance that their sins would be absolved by the work of tiny hands. The lie became a holy truth, spoken from pulpits, carved into stone, repeated until no one dared doubt it. What makes this hypocrisy so profound is not just its scale, but its sanctification. The Church did not simply permit the exploitation of children. It wrapped it in incense and scripture, surrounded it with song and ritual, and declared it righteous. The children, stripped of identity, of agency, of childhood itself, were told to be grateful, that their pain brought them closer to heaven, that their silence was holy. But no prayer could mend their backs. No hymn could fill their stomachs. No stained glass window could restore the years they lost inside cloisters that fed on them as surely as any lord's manor. The institutions that claimed to follow Christ, the man who blessed children and wept for the poor, became temples of quiet, systematic violence. And even now, centuries later, the silence around that truth lingers, but the walls remember. The stone steps worn down by barefoot children remember, and beneath the polished altars, the echoes of that suffering still wait to be heard. The stone floors were always cold. Even in summer, even when the sun burned the fields outside, the walls of the monastic school remained damp and shadowed. Children woke before the first light reached the narrow windows, called not by kindness, but by bells that rang like commands. Their beds were hard wooden planks or straw pallets infested with lice, their blankets thin and always slightly damp. Before they could eat or even speak, they were lined up in silence and marched barefoot through corridors that smelled of mold and candle smoke. Some were as young as 5. Their eyes, wide with sleep, were met not with warmth, but with correction. One stumble, one murmur, one glance in the wrong direction, and a hand would strike out, not in anger, but in routine. This was how learning began, not with questions, but with obedience, not with wonder, but with fear. The prayers they were forced to recite were in Latin, a language they didn't understand, but were beaten for mispronouncing. Lessons were held in unheated chambers where breath turned to mist in winter. Ink froze in pots. Fingers stiffened, cracked, and bled. Those who were tasked with copying holy texts were expected to sit motionless for hours, writing with precision despite hunger, cold, and the ache of undeveloped muscles. When mistakes were made, and they always were, the punishments came quickly. A missed word could mean kneeling on stone for an hour. A smudged page might result in no supper. Corporal discipline was not reserved for rebellion. It was part of the curriculum. Children were taught through pain what they could not yet learn through comprehension. Education was not meant to open minds, but to mold them into shapes the church found useful. The holy men who oversaw these schools spoke gently from the pulpit, their words filled with warmth and love for God. But when they turned from altar to classroom, their voices chilled. Their touch became correction, their compassion conditional. They preached that suffering built discipline, that a cold body trained a warm soul, that hardship in youth would lead to strength in heaven. And so they did not light fires in winter. They did not loosen schedules during illness. They did not offer affection when a child's lips turned blue or their hands shook too much to write. Instead, they offered scripture. Blessed are those who suffer, they said. Blessed are the meek. They taught that a child's greatest virtue was endurance, that tears were selfish, that shivering was a test of faith, and that comfort was a worldly distraction. The smallest comforts, a second bowl of thin gruel, a moment by the hearth, were rewards offered only to the most obedient, the most silent. Children learned to compete not for knowledge but for survival, to earn favor by reporting their peers, by memorizing lines without question, by hiding their pain. The goal was not enlightenment. It was submission. And the church called it virtue. Outside, families whispered that these schools were places of opportunity, that children who studied here might rise to better lives. But the children inside knew otherwise. They saw no path but service, no reward but less suffering, no future but more of the same. Their days were consumed by repetition of prayers, of punishments, of hunger. Their minds, still forming, were shaped by fear and deprivation, and their hearts, once open to love and laughter, slowly closed in the silence. The holy buildings stood tall against the sky, adorned with bells and towers and colored glass. But inside, at their foundations, were children curled against the cold, whispering verses they did not understand, trying not to cough, not to cry, not to collapse. The church promised light, But in these schools, there was only stone and silence, and the long echo of footsteps on freezing floors. And somewhere in the shadows, a child tried to remember what warmth felt like, not just on their skin, but in their soul. The quiet scratch of a quill on parchment filled the candlelit room. A monk hunched over a wooden desk, his ink-stained fingers moving with practiced precision. The page before him was not a holy text, not a passage of scripture or a psalm of praise. It was a ledger, a long, methodical list of names, or sometimes just initials, followed by numbers, tallies, annotations. Boy, 8, strong hands, carries water, eats little, obedient. Girl, 7, sickly, less useful, complains, replace if condition worsens. This was not an isolated document. Every monastery kept such records, carefully maintained, meticulously updated. Children were not viewed as souls to be nurtured or minds to be educated. They were labor units, commodities, investments. Their value was recorded alongside livestock, grain, and tools. Their usefulness measured in the same language as sacks of flour or bundles of wool. If a child ate too much, worked too slowly, or fell ill too often, their name would be marked, their fate quietly considered. These records served many purposes. They helped monastic administrators allocate resources, plan workloads, justify purchases. But more than that, they institutionalized a mindset that children were not people, but entries. A name in ink could be crossed out and replaced. A child who died was simply removed from the inventory. No ceremony, no grief, no acknowledgement beyond the necessary logistical adjustment. Some ledgers even included calculated estimates. How many hours of labor could be extracted from a child over the next season? How much their output might be worth in wool, cheese, or coin? If one child was more productive than another, the difference might be noted in margins, influencing how they were fed, clothed, punished. In rare cases, children were named only by numbers, especially orphans with no family. These children had no history, no identity, nothing beyond the work they could do and the cost they incurred. The monks who kept these ledgers did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as efficient. They believed they were stewards of holy resources, caretakers of God's estate. Managing labor was part of maintaining the monastery's mission. And since the Church had long taught that children's suffering brought them closer to salvation, these records were not a moral burden. They were a tool of divine order. If a child cried from hunger, it was a test. If they collapsed from exhaustion, it was an unfortunate consequence of righteous labor. When deaths occurred, and they did, often, the cause was usually listed in brief: fever, fall, weak lungs, refused to eat. Rarely did these deaths lead to investigation or change. The loss of a child was not a tragedy. It was a line item, a number gone from the roll, a space that could be filled with another. The ledger continued, the ink dried, and the work carried on. What's most chilling is how ordinary it all became. These books were not hidden in secret chambers. They were part of the daily operations, kept alongside financial accounts and property deeds. They reveal a society where the humanity of children had been so completely eroded that even those charged with spiritual guidance no longer saw them as sacred. The ledgers offer no insight into the sound of those children's laughter or their weeping. No record of friendships, fears, dreams, only measurements, quantities, margins of error. And while the words written on those pages have faded over centuries, the mindset they reflect echoes still. That usefulness defines worth. That weakness warrants replacement. That pain, when organized efficiently, can be sanctified. Somewhere beneath a vaulted ceiling, a monk turned a page, dipped his pen, and added another name to the list. The child he recorded was still alive, still working, still hoping. But in that moment, in that ink, he became something else, an asset, a liability, a number among numbers, nothing more. The bell didn't ring gently. It clanged, sharp, hollow, merciless. It echoed through the stone halls like a command from something older than sleep, older than comfort, older even than fear. Children stirred beneath coarse blankets, barely warmed by their own breath. The air was damp, their fingers numb, but no one hesitated. The penalty for delay was worse than the cold. Tiny feet touched the icy floor, their steps uncertain in the dark. They didn't speak. They weren't allowed to. They moved like shadows toward the chapel, the youngest helped along by older ones who remembered what happened to those who arrived last. It wasn't punishment that kept them obedient. It was memory. They remembered the bruises, the missed meals, the public rebukes. And so they moved quickly, silently, gathering before the altar as the bell tolled its final call. The night outside was black and vast. Inside, the candles flickered like dying stars, and the children dropped to their knees on the cold stone. The prayers began. Latin chants, memorized by repetition, poured from tired lips. Their voices were hoarse from the day's labor, their bodies still aching. They knelt without cushions, their knees pressing directly onto the rough, uneven flagstones. For some, this was the 5th or 6th time that day. The skin beneath their garments was already raw, but no one shifted. Movement was watched, restlessness punished. One twitch too many, and a stick would find their shoulder. Too slow to bow, and a hand would jerk them into place. And so they focused, not on the words, not on the meaning, but on stillness, on silence, on surviving the next hour, and then the next. The monks watched from behind, silent and unmoving, their robes hiding warmth, food, sleep. But the children had none of these. Their hunger gnawed at them, worse now in the quiet. Their bones shivered in rhythm with the draft that swept through the chapel's cracks. Sometimes blood would seep through the children's robes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. Thin stains spreading at the knees where the skin had broken under pressure and cold. No one cleaned the wounds. No one bandaged them. The children simply pulled their clothes tighter afterward, hoping to keep the fabric from sticking when morning came. And still, the prayers continued. They prayed for forgiveness, for strength, for purity. They prayed for their families, some long lost, some too poor to remember them. And above all, they prayed to stop feeling, not because they lacked faith, but because the pain blurred everything else. The holy words lost their meaning in the haze of fatigue. Faith became something else. Obedience, endurance, a hope that if they endured enough, God might notice. But the God they were taught to fear seemed as silent as the monks. The chapel echoed with ritual, but not mercy, with scripture, but not solace, with discipline, but not love. When the prayers ended, there was no comfort waiting, no warm bed, no food. the children filed out in silence, their knees stiff, some limping, some biting their lips to keep from crying. They returned to their pallets and lay down again, trying to steal an hour of rest before the next bell. But sleep came uneasily. The cold remained in their joints. The hunger never left. And beneath the layers of ritual and control, the bruises remained, not just on their skin, but in their sense of self. They were told this pain made them holy, that suffering brought them closer to God, that kneeling in agony at midnight was not cruelty, but a blessing. But in the quiet, in the dark, a small voice inside them asked, "If God is love, why must love hurt so much?" The question never left them. It simply sank deeper, buried under more prayers, more cold, more blood, until one day they no longer asked it at all, only knelt and bled and prayed. The door to the workshop closed like a tomb. Once inside, the noise became a living thing, constant, sharp, unyielding. Hammers struck anvils, whetstones shrieked against metal, bellows hissed and roared. There was no silence here, no rest, and certainly no safety. The air itself was thick with soot and sawdust, with powdered iron and fine wool fibers that choked the lungs and scratched the throat. Light filtered in through high, dust-smeared windows, but it gave no warmth. The heat came from the forge, and it scorched unevenly, burning your face while your feet stayed numb. Children worked here, not as apprentices, not as learners, but as laborers. Their bodies too small for the tools, too delicate for the strain, yet still expected to meet the quotas of grown men. The rules were simple. Keep working, don't stop, don't speak. And if a tool fell, if a spindle jammed, if a cut bled too long, there would be punishment before help. They stood for hours without shoes, their soles hardened or broken by years of stone and splinters. Some operated pedals, their legs trembling under the constant motion. Others bent over benches until their spines ached and eyes blurred. Accidents were common. Fingers smashed, skin flayed, eyes burned by flying sparks. But injuries didn't excuse them. A wounded child still had hands. A child missing 2 fingers could still sort wool. And if they cried, the overseer would remind them God sees all, including your laziness. The older boys worked the bellows or carried coal. The younger ones crawled under machines to clean what adults could not reach. Some were so covered in grime by midday that you couldn't tell the color of their hair. They breathed through their mouths, trying not to cough. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh. If they did once, they'd forgotten how. The workshop demanded not just their bodies, but their silence, their energy, their childhood. There was no music, no rhythm, but the clatter of labor. Breaks were rare. Food, if given, was dry and insufficient. Crusts of bread, water gone stale. Some children tried to steal a moment of stillness behind crates or in corners, only to be dragged back into the light and slapped for idleness. The masters believed discipline built character. That noise built industry. That pain built profit. And so the children became parts of the machinery. Moving gears, lifting weights, tying bundles, sharpening blades. They began to forget there was a world outside the walls. They spoke in gestures. They counted minutes by the slant of the sun. When dusk fell and the tools were finally put away, they left not in triumph, but in fragments. Bodies aching, ears ringing, hands cramped and blistered. And in the morning, they would come back. Because not coming back meant hunger, meant beatings, meant the streets. No one left the workshop the same, not because they were taught a craft, but because something inside them withered under the weight of repetition and noise. They stopped dreaming. They stopped wondering. Their hands aged faster than their minds. Their backs bent before their time. And all of it, every cut, every burn, every callus, was considered normal, expected, righteous. When visitors came, they might remark on the industriousness of the young. They might compliment the monastery for instilling work ethic. They might even donate, encouraged by the sight of so many tiny figures laboring in harmony. But they didn't see the bruises. They didn't hear the silence. They didn't smell the blood in the dust. The workshop was a place of transformation, but not the kind that lifted you. It remade children into survivors, into ghosts, into hands without voices. And when they finally left the walls, years later, they carried nothing with them but pain and the permanent sound of metal echoing behind their eyes. Their fingers were the perfect tools, slim, quick, and small enough to reach where adult hands could not, into the narrow gaps between gears, around the fine threads of looms, through the tangled knots of wool or wire or rope. They were born with these hands, soft, unscarred, unbroken. But the world had other plans. By the time most children could walk, those fingers were already being trained for labor. No one taught them how to read. No one taught them how to play. But they were taught how to untangle skeins of yarn faster than their siblings, how to clean metal shavings from under the teeth of saws, how to tie knots tight and quick and precise 12 times per minute. And every time they did it right, they were told they were useful. Every time they failed, they were told they were replaceable. And in every case, someone else made money. The profits were enormous, though never for the children. Their labor cost next to nothing. A few crusts of bread, a corner to sleep in, a second-hand tunic. And in return, their masters sold textiles, shoes, tools, candles, ropes, bricks, everything the world needed, all made faster and cheaper by little hands. The more nimble the child, the more money was made. The more obedient the child, the less supervision required. Children were not seen as workers with limits. They were treated as renewable resources. Their hands did not need rest. Their spines did not need straightening. Their minds did not need stimulation. Only their productivity mattered. If they finished their quota, they were given more. If they finished that, more again. And when their hands began to swell, to tremble, to crack and bleed, they were told it was the price of usefulness. That work was its own reward, that they should be grateful to serve. But fingers break, they blister, they split open when asked to pull thread over and over again in the cold. Nails turn black, joints lock. Children as young as 6 developed the hands of old men, crooked, stiff, scarred. When they lost dexterity, they were moved to heavier work. If they cried from the pain, they were mocked. If they slowed down, they were hit. If they lost a fingertip to a blade or press, they were patched up with rags and sent back before the wound dried. And when a hand failed completely, shaking, bent, missing parts, they were replaced. Not mourned, not thanked, replaced. Another child would be brought in. Another set of fingers, fresh and fast, would take over. The broken one might be sent to a poorer task, or thrown out altogether. Not even fired, just discarded, like a damaged part in a machine. The master's profits never slowed. Only the children did. There was no insurance, no record, no grave markers for lost fingers, no count of how many hands had bled to clothe the wealthy, or build the cities, or fill the coffers of the church. No memory of how many children had worked until their joints collapsed. And yet, every fortune that grew behind monastery walls, every estate that expanded, every noble who dressed in velvet, owed part of their wealth to tiny hands, to the hours and hours of stitching, scraping, sorting, lifting, twisting. And if you could have seen those hands, lined up after a day's work, if you saw the raw skin, the split knuckles, the missing nails, you would not have asked how much they earned. You would have asked how they survived at all. The answer, most didn't. Not fully. Some limped into adulthood with their hands curled permanently into claws. Others never made it out. The prophets remained. The children did not. Only the silence of their work and the things they built for others to enjoy was left behind. They were not called by their names, not in the workshop, not in the dormitories, not in the ledgers. Names were too personal, too soft, too human. Names belonged to sons and daughters, to children who were held and kissed and told they mattered. But in the world of child labor, names got in the way. They slowed things down. A name might make you care. A name might make you pause before striking a child or sending them into danger. And so the names were stripped away, quietly, methodically. They were replaced with numbers, identifiers in ink, recorded in brittle books kept by men who never bent a knee to look a child in the eye. Line after line, age and weight and output. How much cloth was folded? How many bricks were moved? How many hours were worked before the child fainted or fell? Each number was a life, but it didn't read like one. The foreman didn't shout, "Emma, move faster!" They barked, 16 on the line, or 34 back to the wheel. The smaller the number, the younger the child. Some barely understood the count. Some forgot their own names after months of hearing only digits. And when punishments were handed out, they were done by number too. Number 23 was caught sleeping. Number 7 stole food. Discipline was easier when it wasn't personal. Easier to justify when it wasn't a child. It was just an entry in the book, a faulty cog in the system. Supervisors tallied injuries, tracked productivity, calculated worth. But they didn't write about pain or fear or hope. They didn't note the cracked lips or the cough that didn't stop or the bruise that kept darkening. Only what mattered, the totals, the quotas, the ratios. And when a child died, a line was drawn, a note made. The number was retired, the bed given to someone else. Even the churches, the orphanages, the so-called houses of care joined in this quiet erasure. Intake records listed children by age, size, skill. Those who could sew or read were valued. Those who cried too much were marked as difficult. But names? Sometimes they were included at first. By the next inspection, they were gone, lost in the shuffle of papers, erased by time, by policy, by indifference. Visitors walking through these places would see orderly bunks, rows of children in uniform, charts posted neatly on the walls, but no names, no signs of individuality, no drawings, no keepsakes. The walls were blank. The children were quiet. To ask a question, they raised a hand. To speak out of turn was to risk the strap. They weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to be used. efficiently, quietly, without protest. And for those in charge, the numbers made it all so easy, so clean. But behind each number was a story, a birth, a mother's arms, a favorite lullaby, a whispered nickname, all buried now beneath cold accounting. And as time passed, the names became harder to recover. Some disappeared from memory entirely. No gravestone, no family, no record beyond a fading entry in a ledger. And yet, the walls they built still stood. The cloth they wove still wrapped noble shoulders. The coins they earned still clinked in rich men's chests. But who stitched the seams? Who carried the bricks? Who bled into the tools? We don't know. Because the children were never meant to be remembered. Only counted. Only spent. Only used. And so they vanished. Not in a moment of violence, but in the slow, quiet erasure of identity. One child at a time. One name at a time. Until all that remained was a book of numbers and a world that never asked what was lost. They said children didn't feel pain the same way, that their nerves were immature, their minds too undeveloped to register suffering like adults did, that their cries were reflexes, not real expressions of agony. And because men in white robes, with letters after their names, wrote this down and called it medicine, it became truth. Truth that justified the beatings, the long hours, the broken fingers and twisted spines. Truth that justified working them through fevers, through coughs that rattled their ribs, through bleeding gums and burning skin. If a child collapsed, it was weakness. If they sobbed, it was noise. If they screamed, it was nuisance. The pain, they said, was exaggerated, or worse, imaginary. Doctors nodded. Priests nodded. Overseers smiled. The science of suffering said children were tougher than they looked, so they were tested, over and over again. When children flinched under whips or rods, it was taken as resistance, not as pain. When they staggered beneath weights meant for men, it was called laziness. And when they failed to rise at dawn after days without sleep, it was a moral failing, not physical exhaustion. Pseudo-scientific pamphlets circulated, echoing the same convenient lie. Children's bodies healed faster, so harm didn't matter. Their bones bent and bounced back. Their skin grew over wounds quickly. They didn't remember trauma the way adults did. All of it wrapped in academic language with footnotes and studies, many of them written by men who had never touched a child gently, never watched one suffer without profit. This belief filtered into every level of society. Masters cited it to justify cruel tasks. Midwives repeated it to parents handing over their young. Even some mothers began to believe it, because belief made the guilt quieter. And so the pain was ignored. Or rather, it was calculated. Suffering became a variable, a constant, a known quantity. How long could a child kneel before the joints swelled? How far could they carry a sack before collapsing? How many stitches could their fingers make before the skin broke? It became math, cold and precise. Not because people didn't know better, but because pretending otherwise would mean accepting the truth. That what they were doing was torture. But if the child's body was made for work, then the work wasn't cruelty, it was nature. That lie gave cover to every man who turned away, to every woman who said, "That's just how it is." It allowed society to move forward with clean hands and averted eyes. even as the bodies stacked, even as the children broke. And when the pain couldn't be ignored, when a boy screamed so loud it echoed, or a girl's hand turned black with rot, they still found words to excuse it. She's dramatic. He's sensitive. They always exaggerate. And if the pain ended in death, well, at least he's at peace now. But there was no peace in how they died. No peace in how they were treated. And no peace in the myths that still linger. The idea that children bounce back, that their pain is less than ours. It was never less. It was simply less convenient to acknowledge, because to acknowledge it would require guilt, and guilt demands change. Better then to cling to the science, to hide behind numbers and charts, to say they're resilient, and keep pressing harder, until something breaks, and someone else takes their place. In medieval towns and rural estates alike, contracts were signed with ink and wax, binding children to labor before they were even old enough to understand the meaning of the words. These contracts weren't hidden. They were public, blessed by churchmen, enforced by magistrates, and respected by families. Some were made in desperation, parents handing over their child in exchange for bread, for rent, for a promise of clothing. Others were formal indentures, written in fine script, describing not just the work required, but the child's status, not apprentice, not helper, but property. The language was careful. It avoided the word slave, but the meaning was the same. The master could use the child's body as he saw fit. He could demand labor at dawn and silence at night. He could punish. He could starve. He could rent the child to someone else. And if the child tried to run, that was a crime. Not his suffering, not his injuries. The crime was disobedience. Once signed, these contracts had no mercy built in. A child was not a person before the law. He could not argue his case. She could not plead for release. The court saw these arrangements as moral, better than letting the child starve in the streets. And so, even when abuse was visible, even when neighbors heard the screams or saw the bruises, the response was cold and consistent. He belongs to his master. Some contracts lasted until the child turned 12, some until 14, others until 21. That was the cruelest twist. Long after childhood had ended, the law still treated the young laborer as bound. The years of injury, of malnutrition, of missed growth and lost learning, all counted for nothing. Time owed was time enforced. The child would serve. And if they died before their term ended, no compensation was given. The loss belonged to the master, not the family. What made it worse was the pride with which these laws were written. Scrolls from city councils boasted of clearing the streets and reducing vagabondage by placing idle children in productive homes. Nobles saw it as charity. Clergy praised it as discipline. It was social order disguised as kindness. Better to work than to beg, they said, even when the work destroyed the body. Better to serve than to sin, they insisted, even when the service broke the spirit. The law gave no space for the child's voice, no right to refuse, no right to rest. The only right was to obey. And those who resisted, who cried out or escaped or struck back, were punished as criminals. Whipped, shackled, jailed, not because they were wrong, but because they had forgotten their place, because they had believed, even for a moment, that they were something more than owned. And so the system endured, century after century, with the law not only allowing cruelty, but codifying it. Even the term servant became a shield, a soft word hiding hard truths. These were not servants. They were children, stripped of agency, held by force, worked without limit. The legality of it all didn't make it less monstrous. It made it more. Because cruelty in shadow is still cruelty, but cruelty with a seal, with a signature, with a sermon behind it, that's something darker, something colder. And long after the laws changed, the damage remained. Bodies misshaped, minds scarred, generations raised on silence, and the words still echoed, "You belong to him." Not because of sin, not because of justice, but because someone, somewhere, put it on paper and called it legal. There was no entitlement to food, not for children born poor, not for children who served. Meals were not routine. They were earned. And not through effort, but through obedience. In the workhouses, on the farms, inside monasteries, food was the first thing given and the first thing taken away. A child who moved too slowly? No bread. One who cried out from pain? No porridge. One who made a mistake? No dinner. Hunger became the default, a tool, a language. The overseer didn't need to raise his voice. He only needed to raise the ladle and pass the bowl along without filling it. The message was clear. Your body is not yours. It is ours. And only we decide when it gets what it needs to survive. For some, the promise of food became the only hope. They learned to anticipate the moods of their masters, to smile through exhaustion, to say yes before being asked. They kept their heads low and their stomachs even lower, because they knew that discipline wasn't measured in bruises. It was measured in bites. A quiet child might get a full scoop. A cheerful one might get seconds. But a slow child, or worse, a defiant one, he'd get nothing. She'd watch others eat, smell the warmth of stew, and feel her own belly twist in on itself. Punishment wasn't a beating. It was watching someone else chew, and knowing you didn't earn it. Over time, this turned hunger into something more than physical. It became moral. It became identity. A child who was fed began to believe they were good. A child who starved believed they were bad. They didn't question the system. They questioned themselves. Why didn't I get food today? Why wasn't I good enough? The shame took root early, so early that even as adults, many couldn't eat without guilt. Couldn't rest without fear. Couldn't feel full without wondering what they had done to deserve it. Some grew thin in protest. Others stole scraps in the dark. But most just learned to live inside the ache. Because even rebellion needed energy, and starvation stole that too. And still, those in power called it discipline, called it order. They said it taught humility, taught gratitude. But what it taught was obedience through fear, dependence through deprivation, love through control. It taught children that even the most basic need, hunger, wasn't something they had a right to. It was something to be granted or denied. Not by God, but by whoever held the key to the pantry. And those keys were always in the wrong hands. In the medieval world, a child had no voice, not legally, not spiritually, not within the walls of home or monastery. A child was not a citizen, not a subject, not even a full person. They were a possession, an obligation, a tool. If they were beaten, it was called discipline. If they were starved, it was called penance. If they disappeared, it was called misfortune. Their words carried no weight. Their tears meant nothing. The concept of justice did not stretch low enough to reach them. If a child tried to speak out, to protest, to run, they were not heard. They were silenced, not metaphorically, literally. Their mouths were shut with threats, cuffs, hunger, shame. A runaway wasn't a victim. They were a thief of time, of obedience, of someone else's property. There was no system to appeal to, no authority who cared. The moment a child resisted, they were no longer a child. They were a problem, and problems were corrected. In some towns, statutes mentioned apprentices and servants, laying out vague limits to punishment, but these were protections for masters, not minors. A child who disobeyed could be whipped, locked in cellars, denied food for days. No trial, no evidence, just the word of an adult, which was enough. If the child screamed through the night, they were disturbing others. If they refused to work, they were lazy. If they failed to make eye contact, they were insolent. The logic was circular and brutal. To be weak was to be guilty, and to be guilty was to deserve pain. No testimony could save them, because no one asked for it. They were not called to speak in courts. They were not invited to confess or explain. Their story did not matter, only their usefulness. Once that was in question, punishment followed, swift and unchallenged. Some children ran. Of course they did. It's the most human instinct, to escape suffering. They crawled through windows, slipped out in the dark, followed the smell of smoke or the sound of carts to unknown towns. But freedom didn't follow. Freedom wasn't made for children. The street was not a rescue. It was another trap. Stray children were noticed, and noticed meant caught. Local watchmen or monks or merchants would take them in, not out of kindness, but to return them or to sell them again. The child became a body with a price. Age, size, docility, each trait a value. Cities didn't protect them. Cities redistributed them to a bakery, to a tannery, to a stone yard, to a convent. Anywhere that needed small, cheap, voiceless labor. That's what they were, a resource. And resources don't get to ask for mercy. Eventually, the child learned. They all did. Silence became their shield, not because it worked, but because it was the only thing left. A year of beatings, and the cries stopped. A season of hunger, and the begging ceased. They didn't stop because the pain lessened. They stopped because there was no point. Speaking brought more pain. Questions brought more suspicion. Even walking with a limp, even holding a bruised side, these were mistakes. You learned to move like nothing hurt. You learned to pray without voice, sleep without rest, wake without hope. And in time, you forgot that justice was even an idea. You forgot that you were supposed to be heard. That once, long ago, your voice meant something. In the medieval world, that forgetting wasn't tragic. It was necessary. Because survival meant silence. And silence was all the justice a child would ever know. Pain was not a consequence. It was a method. It wasn't what happened when something went wrong. It was how things were kept right. In the medieval world, to raise a child meant to control them, and to control meant to hurt. A child was not taught through kindness, not molded with care. They were broken in like a mule, hardened like iron, tested like rope. A belt was quicker than an explanation. A fist silenced doubt. A switch corrected hesitation. Adults didn't ask if pain worked. They assumed it did. If a child flinched, they were paying attention. If they cried, they were absorbing the lesson. If they bled, they'd remember next time. Pain wasn't failure. It was success. And it wasn't hidden. It was public, normal, expected. A child who wasn't beaten was said to be spoiled. A child who didn't fear was said to be lost. And fear was the goal, because fear made obedience automatic. The instruments of this discipline varied from house to house, workshop to workshop. A leather strap behind the barn, a cane in the schoolroom, a rod beside the altar. Fathers used belts, blacksmiths used tongs, monks used sticks. Some sharpened them, some soaked them in salt. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that children learned to read the tools before they read books. A broom handle leaning too close, a shoe removed too slowly. These were warnings. The tools became symbols, and the child's body the canvas. Red lines across backs, swollen fingers, bruises that turned from purple to yellow to green before vanishing, only to return again the next week. And if the pain faded too quickly, it meant the discipline had failed. Some believed it was godly to beat a child. Proverbs were quoted. Warnings were whispered. Spare the rod, spoil the child. In every language, in every town that idea held, pain was holy. Pain was love, or so they said. Children did not agree. They didn't see pain as love. They saw it as air, something always around them, something inescapable. It taught them things, yes, but not the things adults claimed. It taught them silence, not virtue. It taught them fear, not discipline. It taught them to flinch at footsteps, to lie quickly and with precision, to hold their breath at the wrong moment, just in case it turned out to be the right one. Pain made them better at hiding, not better at living. And over time, they stopped asking why. That was the real goal. Not obedience, but acceptance. To raise a child meant to erase the child's ability to resist. If it took 10 lashes or 100, that was the cost. But make no mistake, they weren't beaten because they were bad. They were beaten because they existed in a system that needed them to bend. And bending came faster when pain was the language. In the end, pain became memory. Adults would speak of their own childhoods with pride, of how they were beaten and turned out just fine. They carried their scars like proof of survival and passed down the same tools to the next generation. Not out of malice, always. Sometimes out of belief. Sometimes out of helplessness. Sometimes simply because they knew no other way. Pain replicated itself. It didn't stay locked in a room with one child and one adult. It moved, like smoke, through households, through towns, through centuries. And it was always justified, always wrapped in the language of virtue. The child disobeyed. The child was lazy. The child raised their voice. So the child was punished. Not because the adult was cruel, but because pain was the right answer. The only answer they had. In the medieval world, justice didn't live in courts. It lived in the welt across a child's back, in the split lip, in the trembling shoulders of someone too small to understand what they'd done wrong, and even smaller in the eyes of those who claimed to love them. There was a sound that moved heaven, or so they said. A voice so pure, so high, so clear that it could lift the soul and bring angels to stillness. And they wanted that sound to last. In the chapels and cathedrals of medieval Europe, beauty had rules. Music had standards. Boys sang with clarity unmatched by grown men, their small bodies giving rise to a tone untouched by age, unspoiled by time. But voices changed. Nature had its own calendar. Puberty was the enemy of perfection, so they made a decision. They chose to preserve the sound, no matter the cost. The answer was simple, brutal, irreversible. Castration. They cut boys, some as young as 7, to keep their voices from dropping. And they did it in the name of beauty, in the name of art, in the name of God. A choir of angels, they said. But every angel bled before it sang. It wasn't done in secret. The practice was known, accepted, even praised. Parents gave their sons willingly, trading the chance of fame or favor for a future cut short before it began. Some believed it would raise the family's status. Others simply obeyed the wishes of a patron or priest. Few asked the child what he wanted. Fewer still cared. The operation was crude, done without anesthetic, done without full understanding of what was being taken. The tools were simple: knives, heated plates, tight cords, and the results were unpredictable. Some boys died. Some survived, broken. A few became famous, but none escaped unchanged. Their bodies never grew as they should. Their faces stayed boyish. Their bones stretched oddly. Their lives were long but hollow. No family, no children, no place in the world once their voices faded. They were treasured only while they sang. After that, they were inconvenient. The church blessed it all, not officially, not in doctrine, but in practice, in silence, in patronage. Choirs filled with unbroken voices gave the liturgy an otherworldly beauty. Bishops smiled. Nobles applauded. The public wept at the sound, not knowing the pain behind it, or choosing not to know. In cities like Rome, castrati became stars. But in smaller towns, they were tools, kept in back rooms, trained like animals, replaced when damaged. They had no say in their fate, no legal recourse, no one to complain to. The law didn't protect them because the law didn't see them. A boy was not a person. A singing boy was even less. Just a sound, just a note, just a resource to be extracted, preserved, exploited. The music mattered more than the child, and the silence that followed mattered least of all. Even after the bleeding stopped, the harm continued. The boys were placed in strict regimes, their days carved up by practice, prayer, and performance. They wore special clothes, ate special food, spoke in careful tones. They were kept from other children, from normal life, from any chance at recovery. Their worth was locked to their ability. Once the voice cracked, if it cracked, they were discarded, some quietly, some violently. The rare few who succeeded lived under constant scrutiny, admired from a distance but never loved. And when they died, they left no heirs, no name, no echo. Only a memory, faint and fragile, of a sound too pure to come without blood. Medieval history remembers the choirs. It remembers the music. It remembers the divine. But it forgets the bodies, forgets the cries, forgets the children. In the end, the song lasted longer than the singer, and that, to those in power, was the only thing that mattered. She was born into silence. Before she could speak, decisions were made for her. Before she could walk, roles were already written. And when she was old enough to understand anything at all, the only thing she understood was this: Her body was not hers. In medieval society, girls were not raised. They were prepared. Prepared for labor, prepared for marriage, prepared for obedience. But more than anything, they were prepared to be overlooked. Boys were worked hard, yes, but girls were worked and watched and used in ways no child should ever be. A girl could be beaten for speaking out, for walking too slowly, for not covering her hair. She could be touched by men who were twice her age and 10 times her size, and no one would stop it. In fact, they might call it discipline, or training, or simply the way of things. To be born a girl was to be born into a system that promised no justice and offered no protection. The labor expected of girls was constant and invisible. They cleaned, cooked, carried, sewed, spun, fetched water, raised younger siblings, obeyed elders, and stayed silent. All this before they were 10. By 12, many were already pledged to marry. Not for love, not for choice, but for alliances, dowries, or survival. If she refused, she was shamed. If she disobeyed, she was beaten. If she ran, she was dragged back. Virginity was treated as property. Purity was currency. A girl's worth was measured by how untouched she was, even as the society around her touched her in every cruel way imaginable. Rape wasn't just common, it was unspoken. The word itself didn't exist in most rural dialects. What happened to her was either denied or blamed on her. If she cried, she was scolded. If she fought back, she was punished. If she became pregnant, it was her fault, no matter her age, no matter how it happened. Even religion offered no refuge. The church spoke of virtue, but preached submission. Female saints were praised for their silence, their pain, their suffering. Mary was the model, pure, obedient, holy. And any girl who failed to live up to that impossible image was considered dangerous. Witches, temptresses, disgraces. Girls were taught to fear their own bodies, to cover their hair, to lower their gaze. Even in childhood, they were sexualized and scrutinized. If a priest looked at her too long, it was her fault. If a nobleman took her into his chambers, it was her duty. If she disappeared, no one asked where. The stories didn't survive because no one wrote them down. Only whispers. Only warnings passed between mothers and daughters. Be quiet. Be careful. Be invisible. That was the best you could hope for. Safety came not from protection, but from disappearing entirely. And for those who didn't, for the loud girls, the bright girls, the girls who questioned or resisted, or simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time, the punishment was swift. Public shaming, beatings, isolation. Sometimes worse, some were locked in cellars or barns. Others were given to monasteries not for education, but to disappear. Some were sent to workhouses or to noble households where the abuse became routine. Their stories were never told, their names never kept. History remembers kings and knights and martyrs. It forgets the girls, the thousands who bent over fires with blistered hands, the hundreds who bled in silence, the ones who prayed not for heaven, but for the pain to stop. Girls had no heroes, no legends, no memorials, only silence. And yet, they endured. That, perhaps, is the most brutal part. They endured not because they were stronger, but because they had no other choice. The mind didn't care how small your hands were. In fact, it preferred it. Narrow tunnels needed narrow shoulders. Low ceilings welcomed short backs. And so children were sent underground, not because they were strong, but because they were small. They crawled through veins of stone and coal, dragging sacks heavier than themselves, their breath already shallow before the dust began to settle in their lungs. Some were as young as 6, too weak to lift a tool, but strong enough to fit through shafts no adult could reach. Their job was to carry, to pull, to follow orders without hesitation, and to accept that daylight was no longer part of their life. What they found instead was endless darkness, not just the kind that blotted out the sun, but the kind that seeped into their bones, into their minds, into the shape of their growing bodies. By the time they were 10, most of them had backs that curved like broken branches, knees that never straightened, fingers swollen from sharp rock and constant pressure. Their joints ached in the morning and stiffened at night. Some lost hearing from the blasting. Others lost toes to falling stones. Coughing was constant. But they didn't call it sickness. It was just part of the job. The older boys, if they made it to their teens, learned to recognize the signs. The ones who started spitting blood. The ones who couldn't stop shaking. The ones who sat down to rest and never got up again. Death wasn't a tragedy. It was a number in the ledger. One less mouth to feed. One more body to replace. There were always more children. Always more poor families. Always another desperate parent willing to trade life for survival. No safety laws existed to protect them. No priest came to bless the shafts. No lord intervened to check the air or the beams or the equipment. The mine was a world unto itself. And in that world, children were less than tools. If a wheelbarrow broke, someone fixed it. If a child broke, they were carried out and buried in shallow ground nearby, sometimes not even buried, sometimes just left. The air was thick with sulfur, coal dust, damp rot, and silence. Talking was discouraged. Complaining was punished. Crying was ignored. Some children began to believe the sun was a myth, that the world had always been cold and black, that their purpose was to crawl, to carry, to cough, and to vanish. They sang songs in whispers. They carved marks into the walls to count how many days they'd been below. They learned to move quietly, to brace when the walls groaned, to freeze when the earth above them trembled. Accidents weren't rare. They were expected. A collapse didn't cause panic. It caused a reshuffling of tasks. Someone would dig, someone would drag out the crushed, and work would resume. Childhood disappeared down there, swallowed by the black. But the most horrifying part wasn't just the labor. It was how normal it became. The children didn't know another life. They didn't dream of school or play or rest. They dreamed of growing tall enough to stand upright, just once. And when they couldn't dream anymore, they disappeared quietly, like the dust in their lungs. Forgotten, unnamed. Another shadow in the tunnels, another body claimed by the mine. Not every job a child performed in medieval times was an accident of poverty. Some were created deliberately, engineered with children in mind, not because they were easier, but because they were crueler. Narrow chimneys that no adult could climb, rotating, grinding stones that only small arms could reach beneath, lofts with gaps too tight for men, but just right for a child's foot to slip through. Tasks weren't adjusted to fit a child's size. Tasks required it. In castles and monasteries, in manors and merchant houses, labor was carved out with one thing in mind: How much can a child endure before breaking? The answer, it turned out, was far too much. These roles were not a coincidence. They were calculated, designed to use every inch of a child's body, every ounce of their obedience, every drop of their pain. In weaving houses, tiny fingers were ideal for detangling threads caught in the moving looms, but only if they were fast enough to avoid being crushed. In mills, boys were lowered into grain bins to shovel out clogs, where many suffocated before they could scream. In dye workshops, girls were tasked with stirring heavy vats of boiling liquid, the fumes searing their lungs and staining their skin forever. Chimney sweeps, among the most infamous, were chosen for their bony frames, perfect for sliding through soot-packed flues. The job destroyed their knees, their lungs, and sometimes their lives. Some got stuck, some fell. Some came out coughing blood and never stopped. These jobs weren't modified when children began dying. They were replaced. The slot remained. The task continued. Another small body stepped in. The idea behind it was insidious. Children were not seen as not yet adults, but as uniquely suited for certain types of suffering. A child's smallness wasn't a limitation, it was an asset. And where an asset existed, work would follow. In some cases, tools were even redesigned to fit smaller hands, not for comfort, but to ensure longer working hours and tighter control. Some laborers would argue the children were lucky to be needed, to be useful, to earn their place. But what they earned was pain. Long-term damage, bent spines and scorched skin. Some could no longer walk by the age of 12. Some were blind from smoke or dye. And some simply never grew again. Not in height, not in hope, not in trust. What made this reality even darker was the quiet intention behind it. These roles didn't emerge in desperation. They were built, brick by brick, by systems that understood exactly what they were doing. Employers knew children were easier to intimidate. Owners knew they would work for less food. Overseers knew they wouldn't rebel. And so jobs became traps, carefully shaped to exploit the body of a growing child. Not to teach, not to nurture, not to prepare, but to use, fully, efficiently, completely, until there was nothing left, not even the body. Just the memory of a task completed, a profit made, and a child replaced. By design. There were no soft warnings in the world of medieval child labor, no gentle corrections or second chances. When a child disobeyed or simply failed to complete a task fast enough, punishment came swiftly and without hesitation. Among the cruelest methods was the sack, a rough, scratchy bag, often made from discarded grain burlap or stained canvas, into which a child would be forced. Limbs curled, breath tight, movement impossible. The sack was then cinched shut with coarse rope, dragged to a hook or beam, and hoisted off the ground like butchered meat. There they would hang, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, as a warning to others. Silence was expected. Screams were ignored. It didn't matter what the offense had been. Talking out of turn, breaking a tool, failing to kneel fast enough. Once inside the sack, all crimes were equal. Inside, the world disappeared. There was no light, no sound beyond the muffled laughter of the others or the creaking of the rope. No way to stretch, shift, or protect one's face. If the child cried, tears soaked into the fabric. If they vomited, it stayed with them. If they panicked, as many did, there was no one to comfort them. The sack was both punishment and isolation chamber, a tool meant to break something deeper than bones. It attacked dignity. It fed on fear. And it worked. Children emerged shaking, quiet, changed. Sometimes they lost their voices for days. Sometimes they soiled themselves and were beaten again for that. Sometimes they never spoke the same way again. And that silence to the adults meant the method had worked. Supervisors called it discipline. Clergy called it correction. Parents, if they ever found out, were told their children were being shaped into obedience. No one called it torture, but it was. The sack left no visible scars, which made it all the more dangerous. The damage was internal, psychological, emotional, neurological. Children began to flinch at shadows, to panic at enclosed spaces, to stop laughing. They would obey faster, speak less, eat less, sleep in tightly curled shapes as if still inside that fabric cage. Those who had experienced it more than once often became eerily still, as if bracing for the next rope, the next dark fall. The body remembered, even when the bruises faded. The worst part wasn't the act itself, but its purpose. The sack wasn't meant to correct a behavior. It was meant to erase defiance, to make the child not just obedient, but grateful for being released, grateful to return to the dust, to the pain of labor, to the cold floor and empty plate, grateful to no longer hang like a carcass. And when the rope came down, when the sack was sliced open with a rusted knife, the child didn't protest. They crawled back into line. They limped back to work, and they never asked why. Because they already knew the answer. They weren't children. They were property. They were bodies to be used, disciplined, and, when necessary, hung up in silence. Dreaming was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. In the world these children inhabited, to imagine a life beyond the walls, beyond the dust and lashes, was to invite punishment. The adults around them, the overseers, the clergy, even their own parents, taught them early that wanting more was a sin. To wish for something else, something gentler or brighter, meant you were ungrateful. And ingratitude, in this world, was indistinguishable from rebellion. So the dreams were stripped early. Not all at once, but methodically. A girl who dared to sing while working would be silenced. A boy who lingered to watch clouds instead of hauling coal would be struck. A child who said, "What if?" would be reminded what is. No future, no freedom, no alternatives. Just the work, the cold, the hierarchy, and the silence. At night, when the body had nothing left to give and the eyes blurred with exhaustion, the mind still tried to escape. It conjured pictures: a full bowl of soup, a field with no fences, a place where names were spoken kindly. But even in sleep, the fear remained. Children were taught that God could hear their thoughts, that bad dreams meant bad hearts, that to imagine another path was to insult the one they'd been given. So they learned to shut the door, even inside themselves, to flatten every urge, to bite down on every flicker of hope. Some succeeded. They became small, compliant, void. Others failed and were punished more. It was always the dreamers who bled first, the ones who asked questions, the ones who looked up. The institutions around them, religious, legal, familial, All shared a common goal: to create workers, not individuals. That required breaking not just bodies, but imaginations. Schools were designed like prisons. Prayers were full of submission. Stories, when told, were warnings, not adventures. He who asks loses. She who runs dies. The world is cruel. Be grateful for your place in it. These mantras were whispered into ears before they could even speak full sentences. And by the time they could, they had already stopped asking. What was there to say? To whom? Every attempt at self-expression was twisted into defiance. Every glimmer of curiosity was met with suspicion. The only acceptable dream was obedience. And even that wasn't a dream, just a default. In the end, the goal wasn't just to produce obedient children. It was to produce adults who no longer remembered they had once been children. Adults who wouldn't speak up when the next generation was put to work. Adults who would see a child crying and say, "That's how we learned." Adults who would beat their sons and say, "That's how we became strong." Adults who had been taught not to dream and who now passed down that emptiness as tradition. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Because when a society makes dreams dangerous, the safest thing to do is to forget them entirely. And that's exactly what most did. They didn't just stop dreaming. They stopped remembering that dreams had ever mattered at all. Education, in the world of child labor, was never about enlightenment. It was about compliance. Children were taught just enough to serve, no more, no less. Reading was limited to instructions. Writing was restricted to ledgers and signatures. Arithmetic served a single purpose: to count, calculate, and complete quotas. Thinking, especially the kind that led to questions, was discouraged from the very start. Lessons were not structured to broaden minds, but to narrow them. Memorization replaced reasoning. Repetition replaced understanding. A child who could recite commands or tally goods was useful. A child who asked why was dangerous. So education became a leash, short, tight, and never leading anywhere new. In many places, schools weren't even buildings. They were corners of factories, back rooms in churches, or fields where children recited rhymes between tasks. A wooden slate, a dull piece of chalk, and hours of rote copying. That was the curriculum. Discipline was paramount. Mistakes meant punishment, not correction. A child who miswrote a figure might be caned. A child who misunderstood an order might go hungry. There was no room for error, and even less for creativity. Teachers weren't mentors. They were enforcers. Their job was not to inspire, but to condition, to create predictable, obedient workers who didn't hesitate, didn't deviate, and didn't dream. And yet, the cruelest part was how successful this system often was. A child raised under such instruction rarely realized what had been taken from them. They grew up believing that knowledge was a burden, that curiosity was a flaw, that silence was wisdom. By the time they reached adulthood, they could balance a ledger but not question its purpose. They could follow a command but not imagine an alternative. They could name their masters but not themselves. This was the true cost of their education, not just the absence of opportunity, but the loss of identity. They were taught to serve so completely that even their thoughts bent to the will of others. The tragedy ran even deeper when these same adults became parents. Believing they were doing right, they passed the same lessons to their children. Not because they were cruel, but because they knew no other way. They taught their sons to bow, their daughters to hush, their families to accept. And so the cycle turned, generation after generation, each more certain that obedience was virtue and silence was peace. Education, as it was practiced in this world, did not end ignorance, it institutionalized it. And in doing so, it guaranteed that the chains placed on a child's hands would remain long after the child had grown too old to feel them. Long before a child could read a sentence or spell their name, they learned the language of fear. It was the first lesson, and often the only one that truly stuck. A raised hand, a sudden silence, the sharp tone of an adult's voice, these became more meaningful than any textbook or sermon. Children didn't learn with joy or play. They learned through survival. Every glance had to be measured. Every word had to be weighed. Every breath had to be quiet enough not to offend. Because one wrong move, one misinterpreted silence, one blink too long, and the consequences could be swift and brutal. In this world, language didn't come from books. It came from bruises, from the way footsteps echoed down stone hallways, from the cold shift in air when a door creaked open. A child might not know grammar, but they knew how to read the twitch of an overseer's jaw. They could translate the meaning of a clenched fist faster than any phrase in Latin. They knew when to shrink, when to nod, when to vanish. It wasn't instinct. It was training, drilled in day after day. And unlike letters or sums, forgetting this language could mean punishment or death. Even among themselves, children passed fear like a shared dialect. Older ones taught the younger not with lullabies or stories, but with whispered warnings. Don't look him in the eye. Never speak during supper. If you drop your tools, don't pick them up, so wait. They mapped the terrain of danger like scouts in enemy territory, knowing which adults could be approached and which ones snapped like traps. Play was cautious. Laughter was stifled. Tears were silenced. Communication existed, but it was always coded, always cautious, always underscored by the understanding that being seen or heard could invite pain. This language stayed with them long after they left childhood behind. As adults, they flinched at sudden sounds. They hesitated before speaking their minds. They raised their own children with the same sharp glances and clipped tones they had once feared. Not because they wanted to, but because it was the only language they had ever truly mastered. Fear had shaped their tongue, their spine, their sense of self. It wasn't just how they were trained to survive. It was how they were taught to exist. And in the silence that followed their obedience, no one ever asked what might have blossomed had they been taught any other way. There were no posters, no search parties, no names etched into stone. When a child vanished in medieval times, the world barely blinked. They disappeared in silence, from fields, from workshops, from churches. One day they were seen carrying buckets too heavy for their frame or coughing blood into the dirt, and the next, they were gone. No records, no prayers, no mourning. Just an empty space where a small body had once labored. In a society where children were valued only for their output, their absence wasn't tragedy. It was inconvenience, at best. Some disappeared into the ground, buried hastily behind monasteries or under stable floors. Some were sold, smuggled, or taken by passing traders who knew the value of a quiet child. Others simply collapsed and were dragged away, by animals, by rivers, by the hands of men who never answered to anyone. These weren't crimes, they were logistics. A sick child was a liability. A disobedient one was a threat. A dead one was a problem solved. Those in power learned not to ask questions, and those without power learned not to speak. Families who lost a child learned to bury their grief beneath layers of silence. Many didn't even know the child was gone until days had passed. In overcrowded orphan houses and labor camps, roll calls were rare and names were blurred. A missing body might be explained away. He ran, she was moved, they're working in another town now. Lies were currency, and truth didn't pay. Mothers might suspect, fathers might ache, but few dared to question. Those who asked too much found themselves punished or vanished in turn. In time, even they stopped counting, and so the children kept disappearing, by the dozens, by the hundreds. Lost to disease, to punishment, to starvation, to cruelty too mundane to be noticed. Their stories were never told. Their bones, if they were lucky, rested somewhere dark and dry. More often, they were left to rot where they fell. History did not record their names. The ledgers that tracked their labor had no columns for loss. And in the centuries that followed, when people spoke of the innocence of the past, they never meant these children, the forgotten, the missing, the erased. The cloth was fine, the stitching perfect, the dyes impossibly rich, and none of it came without pain. Each fold of velvet draped over a noble's shoulder was woven with the exhaustion of children who never saw daylight. Their fingers bled into the fibers, their backs hunched over frames too large for their bodies. They worked in silence, in damp cellars and suffocating lofts, pulling threads until their knuckles cracked. Some lost eyesight from the strain, others lost fingers to shears or spinning cogs. Still, the garments reached the courts immaculate, free of blemish, but soaked in unseen suffering. The aristocracy did not feign ignorance. They admired the delicacy of work only small hands could achieve. In salons and banquet halls, they boasted about the origin of their silks, woven in the abbey schools or finished by the orphans of St. Gregory. These weren't confessions. They were badges of distinction. Pain was a selling point. The more cruel the process, the more elite the garment. To wear something made by the dying was to signal wealth, distance, and power, and no one questioned it. Beauty justified everything. Merchants fed the hunger with smiling mouths and ledger books. They bought from monastic workshops, where children worked for nothing but crumbs and fear, and sold to nobles who demanded perfection. No uneven stitch went unpunished. No delay went unnoticed. Children who could not meet quotas were whipped, starved, or replaced. Their names didn't matter, only their output. The fashion industry of the time was not peripheral. It was central to the economy, and children were its machinery, silent, exhausted, and disposable. When they broke, another took their place. Centuries later, when these garments appear in paintings or behind museum glass, they're admired for their elegance. Few speak of the hands that made them, the chapped skin, the missing nails, the small corpses wrapped in rough linens and buried behind workshops. The beauty lives on, the children do not. This was not a flaw of the system. It was the system. To wear luxury was to wear pain, and those who could afford it did so proudly. Wrapped in cloth, no child would ever live long enough to wear themselves. They survived, but not intact. The children who made it through the cold, the beatings, the endless shifts, they did not walk out whole. They carried the bruises in their muscles, the flinches in their spines, the silence in their mouths. But worse than all of that, they carried the memory. Not as story, but as reflex, as instinct, as the only language they had ever learned. When they grew older and the whip passed into their hands, they did not hesitate, not because they enjoyed it, but because they saw no other way. Pain had been their mother, fear their school. Now they taught it forward. There were no manuals, no formal rules that said, if a child speaks, strike them. If they pause, shout. If they bleed, ignore. And yet every adult seemed to know. They repeated the rituals without needing to ask why. It wasn't hatred that guided them. It was imitation. They remembered how the masters had looked at them, not with cruelty, but with the flat eyes of someone who had seen it all before. That same dullness settled into their own faces. Their voice lowered the same way. Their hands moved in the same rhythm. They were not inventing new pain. They were rehearsing what had already been performed on them. Some of them cried afterward, behind the stable or in the corner of the chapel when no one was watching. A few whispered apologies to the sleeping forms of the children they'd punished, but most didn't even register the guilt. The cruelty was so normal, so tightly stitched into the seams of daily life, that they couldn't even name it. To them, this was discipline. This was duty. This was how you prepared the next generation, not for happiness, but for survival. Tenderness had no place in that economy, and so even those who wished to change found themselves trapped, not by chains, but by memory. This is the legacy no painting shows, no census counts. Generational trauma does not end with one funeral or one apology. It curls through centuries, through parenting, schooling, punishment, and prayer. It teaches itself, it adapts, and unless named, it repeats. The worst cruelty wasn't the child whipped in a monastery. It was the fact that years later, that same child would become the one holding the whip. Not out of malice, but out of memory. That's how the system protected itself, not just by force, but by inheritance. And that's why it endured. There was no monument, no statue, no book of names. And yet, the entire medieval world rested on the bones of children. Roads were paved by their feet. Cloth was woven by their fingers. Bread was baked by their sweat. From dawn to dusk, in fields, in kitchens, in mines, and in monasteries, they bent, scraped, hauled, and suffered, silently, invisibly. Their labor wasn't just useful, it was essential. Entire economies depended on them. Families bartered with them. Lords profited from them. Priests disciplined them. And no one asked whether it was right, because it had always been this way. The idea of childhood as something sacred, something to protect, did not exist. A child was a resource, a tool, a mouth to feed or a hand to use. If they lived, good. If not, another would be born. Death rates were high, names were few, grief was brief. The loss of a child was not a tragedy. It was a routine, especially for the poor, especially for the unwanted, especially for those sent to work before they could even form full sentences. Some were traded, some were sold, some were given to monasteries or guilds, but all were used and broken and discarded. The foundation of every shining cathedral, every rich merchant's house, every crown jewel was built on their backs. Their tiny bodies made the fabrics nobles wore. Their small hands cleaned the church floors. Their skinny arms turned the mill wheels. And when their usefulness ended, they disappeared. Some into graves, some into ditches. Some simply vanished from memory. No songs were written for them. No saints named after them. Their suffering was not just ignored, it was normalized. Explained away with theology, with economy, with custom, as if suffering was simply their place in the world. And so, when we speak of medieval glory, of chivalry, of grandeur and faith, we must remember what stood beneath it. The bones of thousands, of children who never grew old enough to tell their stories, who never had time to rebel, who never had the strength to ask why, because they were too hungry, too cold, too tired. And yet, they built a civilization, not as rulers or heroes, but as fuel, as structure, as foundation. And until we say their names, until we face what was done, that civilization will remain not noble, but haunted. Because nothing truly great is ever built on silence and bones, without paying the price. That was the world behind the stained glass and carved stone. A world where childhood wasn't treasured, it was taken. Where silence wasn't peace, it was fear. You've walked through shadows tonight, and not the kind time erases. These were real places, real children, real wounds. Not myths, not metaphors, just history as it was. And now the candles have burned low. Let the quiet settle. Let the weight of the past soften into sleep. Tomorrow we'll uncover another forgotten corner of history. But for now, close your eyes. Not every story ends with justice, but every story deserves to be remembered. Good night.